What we thought we would do this morning would talk a little bit about what we're calling a disruption in retail. My name's Steve Sadove. I'm the former retired chairman and chief executive of Seks, which is a luxury department store in the United States. I was also chairman of the National Retail Federation, which represents all of retail in the United States. And I've been working with the MasterCard team on how we can improve the retail experience. And James?
Thanks, Steve. Morning, everyone. I'm James House, co-founder and CEO of a company called 5-1. Our focus as a business is helping retailers and consumer goods companies use data to improve the customer experience. We've worked with around 50 different retailers across the globe in about 17 different markets, and delighted that last year our business was acquired by MasterCard, really to help MasterCard develop and differentiate its relationships that it has with retailers. I've also spent over a decade working with retailers in South Africa, so I know a fair bit about this market in particular, but also retailing in Africa, and worked with some of the leading retail brands within the continent. Most recently, I've spent the last sort of 5 years leading the team that developed and implemented Africa's largest loyalty program, the Pick and Pay Smart Shopper program, over 10 million active customers, and a program that's held up as being best practice and an award-winning scheme within the African continent.
All right, so why don't we talk a little bit about, come on, why don't we sit down and talk, oh, that's who we are. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we call the disruptions in retail and what's happening. And I made a comment that we're living in a period right now that is probably the biggest disruption that any of us have ever seen in our careers in retail. And I don't make a statement like that lightly. There's more change going on, and the words that are on the slide here, omni-channel and retail and mobile, are really the primary drivers of it. And everybody's been hearing this term omni-channel. It's affecting the consumer globally, and it really is essentially the consumer wanting product anywhere, anytime that they can get the product. They want to buy it online, they want to buy it in a store, they want to pick it up in a store, they want to have it shipped from the store or to their home directly. Those are the phenomena that are that's going on, and mobile is a primary driver of the change. Right now, mobile is in the United States, and I think it's probably true in most of the developed markets, is affecting about 80% of purchase decisions. It's not saying that people are buying 80% of the product online. It means that they're checking out their smartphone, they're checking what their friends think about a product. Used to be that people would go into a store and they'd ask the associate what they think in terms of getting the advice. Now what they're doing is they'll take a selfie and they'll ask their friends what they think. So the world has changed. And I think that the fundamental behaviors of how you operate in that world have changed. And this led to the question of our stores, and Jan was talking about it earlier, what's going to happen to stores? And I was commenting to James this morning, yesterday may have been one of the, may not have seen this, but yesterday may have been one of the most important days in the history of omni-channel retailing. And you say, what's Steve talking about? Yesterday, Amazon announced it's opening a store. Now think about that. Amazon opening up a retail store. Now we've now started to see the blurring of what's going on between stores and the internet. 10 years ago, internet's going to kill the stores. Stores are going to go away. No longer. Now it's both. You've got to be seeing both. And I think that it's a major change. I know, James, what do you see from, James has had enormous experience in working with retailers as they develop the strategies on omnichannel. How are you viewing this?
Look, I think you've made some key points there. I think the fundamental one being there is this mashup, as I would call it, of the physical and the digital. So customers want to move seamlessly between channels, and they expect you as a retailer to do the joining up. You've got to do the hard work to connect customers to product, as Steve says, when they want it. So at MasterCard, we did a recent survey where we spoke to 10,000 customers, or omni shoppers as we called them, around the world, to really get their perspective on how they're making buying decisions. And as Steve said, one of the key factors coming out of that is that the mobile, the smartphone, or the tablet is involved in around 80% of decisions that get made. So, okay, so you've got that context. I think importantly as well, and again, Steve touched on this, I think the reports of the death of the store have been hugely exaggerated. Globally, still only around 10% of retail transactions are online. So 90% of retail sales are still happening in the store. So you've got this transition to mobile technologies. You've also got the store remaining an important part of the interaction. So, how do you bring together the best of both worlds, if you like, to deliver the customer experience? So just, an example I'll call on is we've worked with a leading department store in Europe, and one of the things we've helped them do is implement iBeacon technology within the store, so that when a customer's coming into a store, and probably when most people are shopping, they're always on their smartphone, as Steve said, whether it's updating their mates on what they're doing, or whether it's looking at product, etc. So we're now able to actually, based on our understanding of customers and brand preferences, trigger offers to them when they enter the store. That's a great example of how you can use mobile and store together. And importantly as well, this concept of clienteling, which I think was coined in the US. You have to think long and hard about what it actually means, but basically it's linked to customer service. So we're actually now empowering sales associates in that department store with customer insight and information, so that they know when good shoppers walk into the store, and that they're able to understand a bit more about the types of brands they like, the availability. They can look at the stock. So this idea of joined up inventory between the stores and online is increasingly important. So it's complicated, but you can certainly see forward-thinking retailers are making strides in this area.
I think James's word, "it's complicated," is an important one. And we're going to try and get through some of this so we can maybe do a little bit of Q&A. But one of the things that I found running a retail company for the last decade was that in order to play in this emerging space, to be an omni-channel retailer, you have to have the technology framework to be able to do it. And what I mean by that is you have to be able to have a single view of the customer, single view of the inventory. If you're going to buy online and ship it from a store, you've got to have one inventory view and be able to move the product from one channel to another. If you want to have an understanding of your customer shopping behavior online versus in store, you've got to have a single database that allows the customer to, you understanding that customer's behavior across channels. That's a fundamental capability that we certainly didn't have 10 years ago, and many retailers don't have today. So go back to this word, it's complex. Just as competing in Africa is complex, setting the framework for how you're going to play in this omni-channel environment, that's a foundational element that I think you have to have. I think it leads you to if this clicker goes, to a second area that is transforming retail right now, and it's also complex, which is big data. And let me turn to James just to define what you think you're saying when we talk about big data.
Look, I think unless you've sort of been holed up on Mars, you'll have heard big data, right? I think it's one of the most hyped concepts to, hit business and retail in particular in recent years. And I think it was really coined to encapsulate the fact that with changes in technology, the volume of data, the velocity of that data, and the variety of that data was very different. I think there's one important V missing from that definition, and that's the value. I think that's importantly where a lot of businesses and retailers in particular are struggling, is actually what is the value that I can derive from big data. So if you think about, and one of the big research houses, Gartner, talks about the hype cycle around big data. And I think certainly when big data was at its peak, there were huge inflated expectations that big data would solve for probably every single problem that the business had. It would enable you to have long-lasting, successful relationships with customers, make sure you had product where you needed it. And I think as a result, a lot of businesses invested massively in so-called big data solutions, whether that's technology, data warehousing, etc. And I think that then led to what we would call the trough of disappointment. I think for a lot of retailers, they invested massively and didn't really see the return. What we're now seeing is this plateau of profitability, where I think smart retailers are working out how can they use data to drive profitable behavior for their business. So, and that's what we call within MasterCard, we call it kind of big data. So what types of data are retailers and businesses using that drives value? And that tends to be transaction data, it tends to be EPOS data, It tends to be data that's derived from payment card solutions or loyalty card solutions. And that's really where we're seeing retailers develop profitable relationships with their customers, is using that type of data. Not trying to, as we would say, sort of drink from the fire hose of big data where you're trying to analyze raw Twitter feeds, for example. I think it'll be very hard to drive value within a time frame that your shareholders expect if you're trying to do those types of analytics at this point.
I think I'll just switch to the next slide, which to me ties to big data. I found the amount of data that we had overwhelming. We could have told you by SKU going back 10 years how much James, as an example, or Ian over there, how much you bought at Saks, what items you bought. But what we didn't really have was a deep understanding of the consumer in terms of what did the data mean. And the reason I got involved with James was we brought James in actually in the 5-1 team prior to them being bought by MasterCard to sift through the unbelievable amounts of data that we had to understand what was really going on with the consumer, what were the true some segmentation, bringing it down to a level at a local store level, and understanding how our customer was behaving so that we could then affect purchasing decisions relative to assortment by store, assortment by region, and then be able to look at customer segments that we could target to the individuals. So as I think about the evolution of retail, it's going from everything's national, everything is one size fits all, to a customer understanding that allows you to localize. One of the interesting pieces of data in the United States, and I do believe that what you're seeing in the United States and Western Europe is migrating to the behaviors that you see certainly in South Africa, where it's a more developed retail market, and I think it's leapfrogging in the other markets because mobile penetration is just skipping some of in terms of the supply chain. But what you found was that the customer, the customer is thinking more local and small. So that in the United States, for example, sales trends as we speak are much stronger in small businesses than they are in the mega businesses. It's because of getting to a local customer understanding and be able to target and pinpoint your marketing directly. And I think the big data, which James correctly says flopped a little bit because it became a buzzword, taking it down to a real consumer understanding at a micro level and changing your marketing tactics, affecting your loyalty programs, is really where the action is now.
Yeah, no, I think action is what it's all about, and I think you've got to be able to action the analytics that you do, the insights that you do to drive value. So, very much our focus on customer understanding now is helping retailers develop this 360-degree view of the shopper. So, in the omni-channel age, customers are moving between channels, they're moving between retailers. How do you develop this complete understanding? So, a couple of ways that we would look at doing that, and the first one, as Steve alluded to from the experience with Saks, is to look at the customers that are shopping in your stores. So what we do is we look at maybe 2 or 3 years worth of transaction history for millions of customers, tens of millions of transactions, and use that to build up actionable customer personas. So let's understand what are the different drivers. So in a high-end department store like Steve's, there'd be fashionistas who are buying, Chanel and Prada. There'd be more classics customers. There'd be customers who are maybe just buying accessories. So how, with that understanding of your shoppers, can you better start to target your offer? And target your offer doesn't just mean we do direct marketing. As Steve said, it means how do you localize assortment? How do you think about the way you run your business as a whole? I think importantly, what we're now able to do, and I think this is kind of very much groundbreaking, is also start to introduce an external view, because I think most retailers, you don't only want to understand what your shoppers do with you, but what else do they do elsewhere. So this is where we can introduce new data sources like those from MasterCard, which actually enable us to understand what are shoppers doing when they're not with you. So in the Saks example, we may have a really high valuable customer spending maybe $20,000 on high-end fashion, but actually, they're spending $200,000 in boutiques and potentially competitors. So we might have thought they're a great customer of ours, but actually the headroom and the potential to grow is far greater.
Yeah, I'm finding it fascinating. Think about the ability to look at a very heavy or a light user in your own chain and understand what they're doing in terms of they may be a heavy or a light user in your competitor chain, and you can think about different marketing that you're going to be doing relative to how you market to them, the kinds of offers, the kinds of relationship building that you do. So it really is, and I think also in the US as an example, Facebook Analytics allows you to merge some of those, that kind of understanding. So you get a much more holistic view of what the consumer is doing. I think there's also fundamental change going on with the retailer and the vendors in terms of how they're collaborating. We used to think in terms of an adversarial relationship. Now it's becoming, and again, I see this very much in the developed markets, a collaboration, the sharing of data, a sharing of understanding, and that partnership in terms of better understanding what the consumer is doing and then using that to build the relationship is a fundamental change in how the dynamics are working. You want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the adversarial point is exactly right. I think typically retailer and supplier relationships, and I've sat in enough meetings with the two in the room, they're quite often this type of a conversation that is about price and trade terms. I think now what we're seeing is a shift in that relationship to more collaborative approaches, as Steve said, and using shopper data and insight as, if you like, the catalyst for those conversations. So rather than retailer and supplier coming to the table with different perspectives on what's happening in the business, what's happening in the category, how shoppers are behaving, is actually we're seeing a common platform around shopper insights derived from that retailer. And the forward-thinking retailers that we see out there are actually embracing suppliers, sharing that insight with them so that suppliers come to the table, come to those discussions better informed about how their brands are bought, how their promotions are performing, what happens when they launch a new product. So, for an example, the retailer in South Africa, we've enabled them to share continuous insights with over 200 of their key CPG partners. And I think this is really changing the conversation and becoming much more collaborative to deliver sustainable growth for retailer and manufacturer.
Well, I'm seeing specific examples. I've seen actually vendors that are funding analysts within the retailers such that you make decisions on what should the adjacencies be. What kind of a buy should we be looking at for a specific vendor? And you find that it's much more analytical, it's much deeper understanding, and it leads you to I think a very big shift in the way that you market the business. The last area that we want to talk about before we open it up to discussion is the talent requirements. If you look at what's required to compete in this arena, not just at the analyst level, but all the way to the CEO level, you really have what I call a whole new world. Because the skill sets, you've got to understand how to use big data. You've got to be able to understand all of the technology that we're talking about. And a lot of us didn't grow up in that world. A lot of us, if you look at the people who have been running most of the big retailers, they maybe grew up as merchants. They didn't have a deep training in some of these areas. And the perception of retail, which tends to be a little bit more of clerks and selling associates, this is one of the most technologically advanced areas and fields that are out there. So there's a transformation both in perception and in reality relative to what's needed to be brought into these organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, from our perspective, we've talked a lot about data and technology. I think without the people piece working effectively, I think the transformation that you're looking to make as a business won't be effective. So from our point of view, engaging with people and the cultural transformation that you need to make as a business to become more customer focused and more customer centric is absolutely key. I've built and developed a business in South Africa. I think there's a huge amount of talent in this marketplace. I think it's a lot of kind of very outward-looking, ambitious individuals in the market. I think that what we've been able to do is some of the concepts that we've actually developed in this market, we've been able to take and implement in so-called more developed markets. So, I think there is the talent pool here. We've always had to work hard to keep our talent. I think good people are in huge demand in this region, and so you've got to work harder to retain your top talent for sure.
So, I think one of the lessons that I learned along this journey of doing this was that we tried early on to do all of it ourselves and build the talent from our internal resources, and it was tough. And whether it's with this guys or the Deloittes or the other, I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from the experiences of others, because we are in uncharted waters, and it is a whole new world there. So with that, why don't we open it up to see if there are some topics. We've covered a very broad range, and see what everybody's interested in talking about. Yeah.
So earlier on you mentioned beacons, and you also mentioned the hype cycle. I wondered where you thought beacons were on the hype cycle, because the experience I've had of beacons is that there's been a lot of excitement about them, a lot of talk about them, but I have actually yet to see them sort of visibly change the way that people shop. I have expectations that will come, but it seems to me that they may be going down towards the trough of disappointment at the moment.
Very good question. I think we've worked on this strategy with a high-end luxury retailer in Europe. So I think one of the things with beacons is they are expensive. Potentially if you're a retailer managing 600 or 1,000 stores, I think that the cost implications are significant. We've implemented it within a retailer with 12 stores, and the feedback from customers has been fantastic. So it's part of the bid to enhance the customer experience. It's not the be-all and end-all. But I think customers within that sort of luxury retailing environment are expecting service, and they're expecting that kind of level of differentiation to make them want to shop again. And it's not just the feedback we get from the retailer, but also when customers take to social media, they're very supportive of the concept of personalization. There's always thrown at us is this kind of big brother accusation. Is this all too big brother? Do customers want you knowing where they are, what they're looking at, etc.? But I think actually customers are now inundated with a lot of targeted kind of spray and pray type communications, and actually something that's much more pinpointed to where they are, what mindset they're in at the time, I think is really successful, and the feedback is fantastic.
I guess I'd broaden my answer to, I think beacons have a role for certain companies. Right now, retailers are being inundated by technology in terms of the solutions and the options and the alternatives, and nobody has the capacity to either spend the dollars or to absorb all of it. And you have to look at what's right for you as a retailer and what's going to really drive enough of a differentiation in your business. It might work for a small luxury retailer. My experience on them is that it's tough relative to a very large retail chain. What I would say, though, is that this personalization, back to that comment about small stores, chains doing better, understanding your needs as an individual. This data privacy issue, we're finding that the younger consumers are very willing to share their data. Older consumers, a little bit less so, but even as they see the value, they're willing to do it. But you have to make choices. Beacons may or may not be the most important technology to invest in. If I didn't have single view of the customer, for example, I'd sure be spending money on that before I would be spending money on the beacons. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I just want to ask you, from a retail perspective, there's a lot of talk around manufacturing your own unique products. A lot of our retailers are bringing their own products to the shelves. Do we see this continuing in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think it's a fundamental change going on. If you look in the United States, most of the department stores, the Macy's, the JCPenney's, Kohl's of the world, roughly 50% of the product is own label. If you're a specialty retailer, it's 100%. You have a phenomenon going on through the internet and the mobile, which is if you don't have differentiated product, basically someone will take an app, they'll scan the item, and it's going to go to the lowest common denominator of price. So you basically have to be selling products that are differentiated because it's going to be hard to win just on service at a much higher price. So the way you solve for that is selling products that either exclusive to you under a label, it could be a name brand label, exclusive to you or to develop your own brand, and I think that trend's going to continue. Yeah.
I thought you could help with this. You talked about the retailer-vendor collaboration, and I thought that was a very critical one, especially from my perspective. When I worked with Coca-Cola, I was on the vendor side, and you had a situation where we thought that you could never get it right with the retailer. Okay, I get to give it to them at much cheaper prices than I do elsewhere with wholesalers. I get to run their their customer promotions for them. I get to even pay for space in their store for them to sell more, etc., etc. At one point, we came up with what they call the joined-up business planning. But to be honest with you, it never worked. There was always the tension between the retailer and the vendor. So I wonder, are there any sort of best practices that you know that you can share in sort of bringing down that tension between the retailers and the vendors?
It's not just in the retail, it's in, let's take your old world, in consumer goods. I sit on the board of Colgate-Palmolive, and the joint business planning that goes on between the retailer and the vendor, the supplier, you have to do it in a way, if you're going to do category management and you're looking at shelf space allocation, you can't look at it just from, if you're the vendor, just from your own perspective. You've got to look at it, what's in the best interest of that retailer, and be fair about it. You can't just look and say, if every time you're saying this is what's best for Coca-Cola, or this is best for Colgate, and not worry about the competition, you're never going to develop that partnership. Similarly, if we're talking about an apparel retailer and you're not sharing data about how your brand's interacting with the other brands within the space and giving a deeper understanding to the vendor that there's real value added, then I don't see that you get to this real issue of partnership. But when you do operate in the right way and share data and people see the value added, enormous amount of, examples would be local direct, let's say you do direct mail pieces that you're customized to that vendor that's targeted at cross shoppers to that brand and another brand. Those are the kinds of pinpointed marketing that you can do when you collaborate.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we're out of time now. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, James. Thank you very much.